All right, sorry for the short delay, hopefully, and I think I've got the camera on now, and I'm rubbing my neck because I'm an old person who's used the computer too much. So, some stuff. Thing number one, uh, turn in stuff. Turn in stuff, if you haven't, and I'll probably grade stuff because I haven't for sure. I was at a work conference. I went Thursday night and then got home yesterday. And I'm so tired from it, and it was a lot of work. It wasn't ACC related. They don't make you work that hard. So, I mean, they make you work hard. You know what I'm saying? All right. So I'm behind on grading. If you're behind on turning in, we're in the same boat. Our goal on due dates really is to try to get caught up around spring break. So if you're behind on some stuff from Unit 2, as much as possible, if you can turn in Unit 2 stuff before spring break, that would be good. As far as penalizing stuff that's a day or two late, it's not that big a deal at this moment. We'll try to be kind of caught up and normal for Unit 3, assuming no more snowpocalypse and nothing else super traumatic, the ERCOT collapsing the energy grid or whatever else could potentially happen, although we should not utter those things out loud. So let's look at weekly questions. And I'm going to yawn at you. Oh, sorry. Okay. And we'll talk about, did I share? Yeah, I did share. I'm sorry. I'm so tired. Okay. So weekly questions, we've got 4 for this unit. I'm assuming everybody's turned in number 1. If not, I'll go back and I'll grade. So, okay. Number 2, which we'll probably talk a little bit about today, explain, discuss, sorry. How did that happen? Where'd it go? Explain the reasons for and describe U.S. participation in World War I. I think that's where we're headed today. And describe how World War I transformed the roles of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. You could also argue, I don't think I mentioned this last time I saw you, you could also argue that it didn't, and I would be okay with that. This one ideally is due this week. That would be good, okay? Number 6, and we'll talk about this potentially on Thursday, describe causes of the Great Depression, be specific and detailed in discussion, what law or absence of law, second conditions for this event. That one, well, that's the one we probably want to talk about if you want to turn it in this week, if you want to turn it in next week. And then on number 7, that's the one, right before break. So things I'd like for you to think about. And crud, somebody just came in. I forgot to mark them present. Oh, I know who it was. I remember. I think I remember. Yeah. Due dates. What we want to talk about, I really think, and we'll decide on Thursday, but here's what I'd like for you to think about. I personally think that you should do the quiz before spring break. So the quiz over 4, 5, 6, and 7. I think you should do over spring break because 1, you're not going to study over spring break, and 2, you're going to forget stuff over spring break. So just a thought. And it puts us a little further behind. The thing I'm more flexible about is if you want to make question number 7 due before spring break or like the Monday you return from spring break, because that way you can work on it during spring break. You wouldn't feel like it was late, but then you could also turn it in before spring break and feel like, haha, I have an entire week break, and you'd feel good about it. So, and then next week also we'll talk about book review because sometimes people start working on that over spring break. So your decision that I'll ask you to make next time is, would you like to, I'm sorry, extend the due date for question number 7, maybe to the Monday of spring break? I wouldn't want to extend it any more than that because I don't want we don't want to have 2 things due on the same week again. And we really don't want to backload the course because you're as tired as you are now, just think how tired you're going to be in May. You know what I'm saying? All right, so do we want to extend the due date for number 7 beyond the Friday before spring break? And are you on the same boat with me on the quiz? Do you want to take the quiz right before spring break, or did you want to take it when you return? I would kind of prefer before, but I really don't care. I just think I'm right, but I don't care. I'm sorry. I think I see a hawk in my backyard. That's why I'm looking. That is weird. Okay. There's a lot of things that hang out in my backyard. Okay. Let's look at notes maybe. Maybe. And if you guys have questions or comments, shout them out, type them in, do what you do. Ask each other. I just posted the same thing. Let's try this. All right. Okay. All right. So I feel like we talked pretty well about the election of 1912. Did I mention to you I didn't grade because I didn't have a chance? Pretty much my meeting started 7 a.m., ended like 10 or 11 p.m. every night, and you wouldn't have wanted me to grade anyway. My guess is grading, it's definitely not going to occur today because I have soccer starting this week, so I have to be there. But I am anticipating some Wednesday, Friday grading for this week to get caught up. So I apologize for being behind, and I'll get caught up. All right. And hopefully we are good on the new nationalism, new freedom question. And I've been over it enough that I'm pretty sure you don't want to hear it again, right? Okay. Plus, most of you probably already turned it in. And a couple of you even sent it so I would look at it before you turned it in, which is cool. And for those, I know there were a couple of you that sent it like late Friday night. I didn't even get back to my hotel room till about 11. So sorry. No, sorry. Okay. Let's talk about making the world safe for democracy. And again, our question was, why did the U.S. get involved and how did that change things for women and African Americans, Hispanic Americans? And you can argue that it didn't. You could do it. Okay. All right. So here's some stuff that was going on. As we were getting ready, let me try again. After we made a bunch of money during the Gilded Age, we used a lot of that money to build up the Navy. And you may or may not have been paying too much careful attention to our naval philosophy during that time period, but there was a fellow named Alfred Thayer Mahan, M-A-H-A-N, who taught at the Newport News Naval War College. Who doesn't know that? Why would you know that? And had been part of the federal government, part of the Department of War. They'll change it to Defense later. So he was a naval advisor, and if you were an officer in the Navy, you either had to read a book that he wrote or probably took a class that he taught. So he's a pretty prominent guy. And then when his older years, you might have worked for him if you worked for the federal government. So he's very influential, and he had a theory about the Navy. His theory was that for the United States to be a world power, we want to do that, that we needed a Navy that could simultaneously win 2 wars in 2 separate oceans. So we need a really big Navy and a really powerful Navy and a really strong Navy. We did not have that after the Civil War. We barely had a Navy at all. It hardly qualified. So we started using the money that we made during the Gilded Age and using the tax revenue, except after 1893 when we had a little bit of a depression. But we started using that money to build up the Navy. Now, one of the cool things about not having a Navy and then having a Navy, when you have the Navy, after not having the Navy, everything's new. So we had the most modern, best equipped Navy, not necessarily the biggest, not necessarily the most expensive, but we had a very modern, well-equipped Navy, probably the best in the world. And, when you have stuff like that, you decide, what? I don't know what you're asking me. I'm telling you why we're going to want to get involved in World War I. I'm giving you the warm-up. It's the warm-up. You can't just go from not having a Navy after the Civil War and then just go like, hey, I'd like to be a world power. Let's join World War I. If we didn't have a decent Navy, we're not joining for World War I. You know what I'm saying? And we also wouldn't have the money to build a Navy if we hadn't had the Gilded Age. So Gilded Age is important, even though it's kind of full of corruption and some sliminess. It also helps us build up our Navy. And it makes us modern, not because of corruption and sliminess, but because of what it does for the workplace. You know, we go from working at home, working in small factories, to having larger factories and becoming a really productive nation. And I'm not saying it's necessarily good or bad, I'm just saying it is. So we produce a lot of stuff, we have a lot of money, and we're going to use that lot of money and ability to produce a lot of stuff to build a big Navy. And then once you have a big Navy that works really well, probably better than almost everybody else's, you say, hey, we got to try this out. So that's where we're at. That's why I'm talking about the Navy. Okay. So we want to use our Navy to perhaps help the neighbors from time to time, like we helped Cuba. I'm sure they appreciated that a lot. And Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, we helped all those folks. And we also want to help our friends in China be more willing to trade. That was China. I didn't quite finish that word. But we want to help our friends in China be more willing to trade with countries like us, because they wouldn't trade with us during that time period. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, perhaps. And then when World War I kind of breaks out, then we also want to get involved and make the world safe for democracy, as we should. So, excuse me. If you were to talk to Teddy Roosevelt, which you can't, because you know he's not with us, but he said this. His proudest accomplishment of his life was building the Panama Canal. Now, people have talked about building a Panama Canal for a long time. That's why I've listed 3 treaties here. And in the 1850s, we talked about it with England, and that's who we make this treaty with. We agree that we will help maintain the canal and help build it if England will also be a partner with us. And the thought was in the 1850s, that's pre-Civil War, if you forgot about dates, we weren't strong enough to keep it open. If you're wondering why we need a Panama Canal, excuse me, sorry. The reason we need a Panama Canal is it shortens the trip if you're trying to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, so it helps with transportation of goods from one hemisphere to the other. You know, it helps you with trade. So that was the deal. You don't have to travel all the way around South America. It's a long trip and expensive and dangerous. All right, so by around 1900, we have become a world power. Our friends in England trust us. They think we can keep the canal open and we would be fair with them. So the second treaty, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, says that they no longer want to be or need to be our partner in the Panama Canal, that we can take care of it on our own. And then the Hay-Bunalvaria Treaty that's one dude's name, Bunalvaria. That is a treaty with Panama giving us permission to build the canal in Panama. Okay, all right. So I'll fill in some details there. So with the building of the canal in Panama, Panama was a colony of Colombia. And so when we decided, after we had the Navy, that we would like to build the canal in Panama, then we asked Colombia, like, hey, do you mind if we build the canal in Panama? And they said, yes, we mind. We do not want you there because you do crazy stuff like Spanish-American War or invasion of Chile, or you mess with Hawaii. I mean, we had done some stuff recently. And they said, we don't want that in our country. We'll just ask the French to build the canal. And so we said, yeah, whatever. And they they hired the French, and the French went bankrupt trying to build a canal. In part because maybe they didn't have, you know, they had to travel farther. And they didn't have the skill that we had at killing mosquitoes. You never underestimate that skill when you're in a tropical area, or Texas. You know, after the snow apocalypse, and then all the snow melted and all the giant ice shards fell and tried to kill me and stuff. The next day when it was 80 or whatever happened, there's a mosquito on my door. I went, dang. Killing mosquitoes really matters because they carry diseases. Plus, it's uncool to have them on your door, but mostly because they carry diseases which you may not have immunity to. We're talking malaria and yellow fever, and that can kill you. So that's kind of what happened to the French folks. They overspent, their workers got sick, and they went bankrupt, no canal. So we went back and said, hey, we noticed, didn't go well with the French. You want us to build it? And they went, nope, still would rather not have a canal than have you. So then Teddy Roosevelt helped to, as it says in quotations here, engineer the separation of Panama from Colombia. So he gave a speech where he said he could tell that the people of Panama were yearning for their freedom and that we would support them in that endeavor. So we essentially said, hey, declare independence and we'll make sure you get it. They did, we did. So there you go. We overthrew a government so we could build the Panama Canal. It was just a little government, right? Colombia. Oh, we did that. This is part of the reason. It's one of the many things in the list of reasons that our friends in Central and South America aren't always overly excited about us, at least during this era. All right, so Panama Canal starts in 1903. I think it takes about 10 years. I think it finishes, and it finishes. We finished building it. It took its time. And it's fairly modern engineering feat and uses a system of locks and pulleys and stuff. I don't know if have you ever been through a canal? We don't have a lot of those in Texas. Oh, is Nick saying anything good? I'll mute him. Cried. Okay. But I don't know if you've ever been through a canal. I certainly have not been through the Panama Canal. I'm not much of a world traveler. Have you guys been through? This is where you can answer me. Has anybody been to the Panama Canal? This gives me a chance to get a drink. Ah. You don't even want to play along, do you? All right, fine. I'm still going to drink more water. Okay, I've been through a canal on the Ohio River near Louisville because I went there to grade AP exams, and it's pretty weird. You go to one spot and then, yeah, I bet if you took a cruise, especially in that region of the world, yeah, you probably went through there. But the boat goes somewhere, you stop there, and then some gates go up or down and some water comes and fills it up, and then the boat rises, and then you float to the next section. To me, it was really interesting. That's because I hadn't been through one before. So, and I'm pretty easily entertained. So, yeah, cruise. I forget too that this is kind of a place where a lot of people go on cruises. So, yeah, cruising through the Panama Canal. All right, enough about the Panama Canal. All right, Panama Canal, though, was part of Roosevelt's diplomacy program that's often referred to as big stick diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy. And he says this is from an old African saying, speak softly, but carry a big stick and you will go far. So if you have a strong military, occasionally break it out, but you may not have to use it all the time. And you certainly don't have to go around making threats if people know you're willing to smack them around a little bit. Goodness, somebody is having internet issues. That is frustrating. Roosevelt Corollary, to them, not to me, sorry. Roosevelt Corollary is extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Do you remember the Monroe Doctrine from 1301 or 1819, more correctly, where during the Monroe presidency, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, writes this idea that there should be no further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere, or we'll put a stop to it, and that we are kind of the rulers of the Western Hemisphere. When we said that, we didn't really have a navy, so our European friends thought it was kind of funny. They really laugh, but they go like, hey, nice try. But we also said this as European countries were typically ending their colonial endeavors, shall we say, in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was kind of the last holdout. And of course, Brazil with Portugal, but we know what, Brazil? Oh, sorry for the big yawn. So, Portugal wasn't worried at all. So we are adding to that and no problem when you guys have to go in and out because you don't have a choice. The Roosevelt Corollary is the idea that beyond just you can't come and colonize, is we don't want you over here for any reason. So if one of our neighbors owes you some money, let us know and we'll pay you and we'll go collect it from them. So we become kind of the loan shark of the Western Hemisphere and the world's policeman. Also, if somebody's economy is starting to collapse, we say, you know what, we have the right to intervene because it affects the rest of the people in the Western Hemisphere. So we might go in and kind of redo their national bank or say, you know what, I think that peso, that's not so cool. So let's go with the dollar instead. So we do change people's currencies. We alter their economic systems pretty much completely during this era. So, and we will intervene. I'm pretty sure your book has a map of all the places we intervene, either politically, economically, or militarily, and it's pretty much everywhere except I don't think we go to Brazil, although in the next, in the 20s, we'll build some Ford plants in Brazil. Yeah, that's more private company thing, but yeah. So Roosevelt's diplomacy is diplomacy by force. Roosevelt serves the end of McKinley's term and then one of his own. Mention that. Also, Roosevelt is a Republican or a Republican. He's not a Republican, but he's a Republican. And then Taft is also a Republican. Okay. So Taft is the guy who follows Roosevelt. He is a Republican. He serves one term, and his diplomacy is typically called dollar diplomacy. And so it's really, if you do what we want you to do, we'll give you money or keep giving you money. And if you don't do what we want you to do, we will take money away from you. So this is cheaper because I know it sounds like it'd be more expensive, but sending the military places is expensive. So this is cheaper and it's also less dangerous in a lot of ways. It does save money. It accomplishes the same purpose. It's still equally as annoying to our neighbors, but there are fewer people killed. So. All right. And then Wilson, who's the guy who wins in 1912 and then serves 2 terms and is a Democrat. And all 3 of these are known as progressive presidents because they all want to use the power of the federal government to make changes. And as we noted, perhaps in our answer to the weekly question, Wilson said he wanted a small federal government, but no, that is not how he behaved. So in the Wilson administration, he used something called moral imperialism or moral diplomacy. And we'll have presidents in the modern era from time to time who vow to do that sort of thing. And this is messy. Now, I will say in general, oh goodness, I don't know what I would do if I were president. I don't know what you would do if I were president either. But I don't know what I would do about foreign policy if I were president, because it would be really cool if we were just like good to our friends and bad to our enemies. But how do you even know who's your friend and who's your enemy? And do you really want to engage outside your country? And is it really your business? And the answer is yes and no. And that's why diplomacy and foreign policy is hard. So Wilson's plan was that we will intervene or fund countries if they do the right thing. And who gets to decide what the right thing is? That would be Wilson. And Wilson was pretty sure he was always right, which is a great quality to have in a president because you don't really want them listening to people. However, Wilson, he's a highly educated fellow, Harvard professor, and then eventually, did I say Harvard? I did. I'm so sorry. Princeton professor. I know some of you are going like, don't mess that up. I'm going to Princeton, not Harvard. I understand. I'm sorry. Yeah, I went to either Princeton, Harvard, or Angelo State. I can't remember which it was. They're all about the same, right? So Wilson was a professor at Princeton and also the president at Princeton. And because he had spent his entire, let me try again. He spent his entire adult life working at a college. He hadn't been wrong in about 40 years. So maybe 30. So we know, and now that you're college, you're experienced college students because you've probably done this a semester or 2 or 3 or 4. that your professor's always right. Have you noticed that? If you tell them like, hey, I think you made a mistake, they go like, hey, you failed. So Wilson, especially as the president of the university, probably have been right quite a bit as well. So he becomes president, and he's good at a lot of stuff. He'd been president of government and politics, so he certainly knows how government's supposed to work or how it can potentially work. And he understands the politics of running an important, well-endowed university, so he'd managed quite a bit of money. But, beyond the university system, he didn't have a whole lot of political experience. He had been elected to be governor of New Jersey and had served 2 years at that before he became president, but at least 1 year of that, he was campaigning to be president. So he didn't have a whole lot of political experience, formal political experience. So he thought that the goal of the United States in diplomacy was to set a good example for the rest of the world about how to behave and treat the neighbors and protect people, that sort of stuff. So we've seen that before, probably just a different variation of it. And we especially needed to teach our neighbors the lessons of democracy. If you're wondering like who we're going to most irritate in the Wilson administration, I'm going to guess it's Mexico. We're going to intervene in Mexico 4 or 5 times. Because we're trying to teach them that they elected the wrong people. So when they elect the wrong people, we'll send the troops in to try to remove some of those people. I'm sure they did not mind that we were violating their territorial and political autonomy and integrity. I'm sure they didn't mind that we thought we ran Mexico. They minded quite a bit. So this is bad news for Mexico. It leads to military intervention in Mexico, and especially keep port cities open. I think we intervened in Veracruz 2 or 3 times in the Wilson administration. There's one time where we're just trying to chase Pancho Villa down to arrest him because he blew up some stuff in New Mexico. We don't catch him, by the way. But one of the guys that helps chase him around, try to catch him, is George Patton, who would be an interesting guy to read a book about if you like military stuff. And he's a little unusual. All right, so we're going to intervene in a lot of countries during the Wilson administration, but we intervened in a lot in the Roosevelt administration and a few also in the Taft administration. So this progressive era thought clearly doesn't keep us from intervening in other people's countries. We think that it's kind of our duty to do this because we have to teach them how to behave properly because they don't know because they're not the United States of America. There you go. All right, are we good so far? I'm going to stop sharing for a second to see if you guys have any questions or to stop looking at what I was sharing for just a second. Okay, do you guys have any questions? I'm going to drink some more water too. I need to put the lid on, don't I? And I really need caffeine. Okay, so you guys don't have any questions? No one has anything to say today. It's just like that in my first class. Like everyone's on strike. Just cut it out, kids. I know you're not all kids, by the way. All right, so let's talk about World War I. Tell me something you know about World War I. Either say it out loud, type it in the chat, anything at all that you know about World War I. Let's hear it or see it now. You can do this. Ooh, something in the chat. I'm super excited. Okay, it was a big war. They didn't call it World War I, they called it the Great War. Not at first, but by the time it was over. Not because it was fun or like woohoo, but because it was really big. So yes, it's a big war. There's Central Powers and Axis powers. And of course, the good side is the side we're on, which is Central. Battle of Verdun, I can't speak French, was one of the costliest of the war. It lasts like 6 months. Millions of people die. It is bad. Yeah, no, it's true. Bad. France leaves the Axis. I think it's Italy that switches sides. I think it is. In the early 20th century, yep, war to end all wars. Great war to end all wars. It's true. You see, you guys know stuff. And nobody really knows why it started. We do, but Treaty of Versailles was 1919, ended the war with German humiliation. That's an understatement of the day. So they're broke and they get punished a lot and they're going to be more broke and then they're going to get mad and then we get Hitler. So I am not blaming Wilson for Hitler. I didn't want it to sound like that. But yeah, Germany gets punished pretty harshly. And looking back, we'll probably say that was a mistake. At that time period, nobody cared. It's like, Germans are terrible, we hate them, let's take all their stuff. So we did. Yes, every country had alliances with everybody else, and then some guy died that nobody even cared about, and then everybody goes like, let's fight. So they did. Yes. Yeah, that system of alliances was a problem that dragged, yeah, everybody into this conflict. It is true. All right. And I think I told you this before, but if you ever want to read something really definitive about the causes of World War I think a good book is called The Guns of August. Guns, like weapons. Guns of August. It's Barbara Tuchman. It's pretty old, but it's super thorough. And you can read the whole book and you go like, oh, now I understand. And I don't. So it's pretty confusing. All right. Thank you for playing along, for your participation. You guys know stuff. I knew you did. I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing. So let's go on. We'll see if I know anything that happened. Okay. So Wilson wants to keep us out of war. This war starts in 1914, and we stay out of it because, an ocean. We're an ocean away from it, and that ocean keeps us pretty safe. When the war starts, we do not take sides, and we want to sell to both sides because God bless America, that's what we do at the beginning of world wars. The U.S. does begin to build up the military, but we declare neutrality over and over again. Peace groups form, veterans of future wars, women for peace, students for peace, oppose U.S. entry. Immigrants tend to pick the home team, wherever they're from. Lots of German immigrants, lots of Italian immigrants in the United States. So the U.S. picking a side might be tricky with, at least 20, 30 million new folks. And the sinking of the Lusitania happens, which makes us a little wary. This is a cruise ship that goes from northeast part of the United States, New York, New Jersey, that area, to England and Scotland. And, in those days, not, just the average person from Cedar Park could afford to take a cruise. Those things were pretty pricey. Yeah, that's mostly true. I know some of you are going like, no, they were the cheap seats on the Titanic. Yeah, you saw what happened to those folks. So the Lusitania is a pretty expensive thing to go on. The United States government decided that would also be a nice way to secretly ship weapons to our friends in England for the war effort. The Germans were aware of this and sank this. The Germans also had proclaimed the end to open travel on the seas. So they said, look, if you're on a ship in the Atlantic, we have the right to sink you. So don't be surprised if that happens. And it did, and we were distressed about it. Now, this is not the reason the United States joins the war. I say this because when I was teaching high school, which was not that long ago, and you have this very nice test called the STAR test. Have you heard of this thing, the STAR test? The state of Texas wants to test you on your vast historical knowledge, which I know is vast. And so they'll ask you, 50, 60 questions about US history and see what you know. When we were studying for the STAR test one year, I told my students, I said, look, I need you to know that if they ask you the reason the US entered World War I or the Great War, you need to say it was because of the Zimmerman telegram, the discovery of the Zimmerman telegram. And then one of my students goes, no, Miss Erna, my world history teacher says because of the Lusitania. I went, nah, that's dumb because Lusitania sinks in 1916. What, we thought about it for a while and we said, you know what? I remember a year ago when you sank that ship, that really upset me. I'm in. No, it was not the sinking of the Lusitania. It was Germany asking Mexico to declare war on us. That was it. Okay, so my students go off and they take the STAR test, and guess what the question was? Pick the cause of U.S. entry into World War I, and guess what the answer was? Sinking of the Lusitania. Dang it, state of Texas, because my choice wasn't even on there. It was stuff like what was it? Stuff like moving the United States to the gold standard, or bombing at Pearl Harbor, or invasion at Quezon, or something like that. And yeah, so the only one that had anything to do with World War I was Lusitania. So I'm just saying, state of Texas, they don't always know. All right, back to business. So Lusitania sinks, which leads to suspension of submarine warfare because we pitch a fit, and Germany really doesn't want us to enter the war because things are going pretty well for them, and we might slow that down a bit. Wilson also doesn't want us to enter the war because he's campaigning for re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So if we join war and the slogan is "He kept us out of war," he thinks it might harm his re-election. He's probably correct. All the while he's keeping us out of war, he's also building up the military. And then as soon as he's elected, he passes the Selective Service Act. So not secret, Selective Service Act. All right, so we stay out of war. We have suspension of submarine warfare. So Germany says, yeah, we won't sink any more stuff. Then Wilson gets reelected, and then Germany starts sinking stuff again. And then Wilson passes the Selective Service Act. And if you are male, you probably are familiar with that. You have to register to serve, not to serve, but for a draft pool in case we decide to pass a separate act to draft you into military service. Now, if you get, I don't know if you get worried about stuff like that, dudes, when you turn 18, but it's not the draft, it's the pre-draft. So we would not be able to draft you with just the Selective Service Act. We'd have to pass a separate piece of legislation, which no congressman in their right mind would sign. So I think the chances of you getting drafted are zero. That's my impression. Because, and some of you probably been in the military, because typically we have like one or two like grown folks in here and they go like, yeah, I was in the military. We don't want you in the military if you don't want to be there. Yeah, we don't, because we have really good stuff, and we don't want you going rogue with our really good stuff. Yep. Okay. Yeah, the folks would tell you we don't want just anybody in the military. It is true. Yep. All right. Ooh, I accidentally closed the chat. It'll come back up though, right? All right, more stuff. Okay. So we passed the Selective Service Act. You got to register, but we're probably not drafting you. We're not drafting you. Wilson begins January of 1917 with Peace Without Victory speech. Your parents have probably tried this as well if you have siblings. I know my parents tried this, but this was the international version. It's like, hey, you guys have been fighting a while. How's that going? Why don't you stop? And that's essentially Wilson's speech. He says, you know what? This isn't working out well for you. Why don't you just stop fighting and go home? And the countries go like, I don't know about you, buddy, but we kind of want to avenge our losses. We didn't have any losses. So it made sense to Wilson in his college professor sort of way. And our European allies just look at him and go like, that was dumb, but nice try. Okay. One of my favorite things about teaching social studies in high schools in Texas is you get to teach with coaches. You know what I'm saying? And coaches are really good about, they want to win, so your star scores have to be high. And two, they like to simplify things because you need to have a coach speech, and the coach speech needs to be short. So they really do a fine job sometimes of thinking up these little acronym things. So my coach friends always like to say World War I started for 4 main reasons, and this works pretty well. So Main, M-A-I-N, Main is militarism. So everybody built up their military, not just us, and they wanted to try it out. That is true. And they used to have these funky war games where they all dressed up in each other's uniforms and went to each other's countries and stuff. Two, alliances. And you guys are already familiar with those and have talked about those. It's like the whole world was a middle school. So we picked, we were on one side or the other. And we picked sides before there was a conflict. The sides were usually chosen by ethnic or for ethnic or historical reasons, like we've always hated your people, or 200 years ago your people invaded my people, or your country's religion doesn't like my country's religion. So these alliances were typically based on ethnic or historical slights, and sometimes religious as well. All right. So like Russia said they would be the defender of all the Slavic people throughout the world. So that's going to pull them into this war when they probably don't want to go. And then Germany gets pulled in because they said they'd back up Austria-Hungary's play no matter what they did. And then Austria-Hungary does something really stupid to start a war with, I always get it backwards, Serbia. And then they want to start a war with Bosnia because the terrorist in Serbia was from Bosnia, and what a mess. And then Russia says, you can't mess with our people. And yeah, okay. And the Russians had a really big army. It wasn't any good, but it was really big. And it's nationalism, like my country's better than yours, so it'd be better for the entire world if we took over your country and made it more like ours, which is sort of like imperialism, but it's not just to take a colony, it's because we're way better than you. And I think the most obvious thing you see that relates to that during this time period also is kind of wrapped up in some racism as well, which is that white man's burden idea. And that's, of course, the Rudyard Kipling thought that England had to go around and socialize the rest of the world, make them cultured. And of course, since we were, similar, we sort of felt the same way. And if you're thinking, is that a white people thing? At that era it was, but it's not always. China always thinks they're better than everybody else. That's kind of a historical thing. Japan thinks they're better than everybody else. Don't tell me that Russia doesn't think they're better than their regional allies. They do. I don't know. I think it's more of a human thing. I'm not sure it's the most positive quality, but I think it's kind of a human thing. I do. All right, let's keep going maybe. All right, so the war is going on, and I'm going to remind you too, because I don't want you to get too distressed about this because I'm not talking about stuff from other countries' perspectives. I'm not because of what class it is, it's US history. So when you cover this in your world history or global history, or I don't know, when I was taking this class, I called it Western civilization, which I'm sure they don't call it anymore, but they might, I don't know. That's when you'll cover it more from a global perspective. So, of course, the Axis thinks, or the Central Powers think they're right, the Axis thinks they're right, or at least they like their team better. I think in this instance, they just like their team better, but our perspective's the one, that we think is right, or at least our country thought was right during this time period. I know that you don't always think the United States is right, mostly because it's not. But so often it is. So I don't know. We'll keep going, but not always. All right. U.S. enters the war after we discover the Zimmerman telegram. We don't really discover it. Our English friends intercepted. Now, England, of course, wanted us to join the war effort long before because they felt like they were carrying the weight of the Western democracies and that we should be helpful. And we said, hey, we'll sell you stuff. We'll even give you stuff. Which I thought I didn't mention, did I? Oh, huh. No, we didn't talk about the neutrality. We go from neutrality and then we go to cash and carry where people can come pick up the stuff. And then, but anyway, we'll keep going. All right, sorry. So we enter the war after the, I think I'm confused. I'm sorry, I'm really tired. We enter the war after the Zimmerman telegram. The Zimmerman telegram is from Arthur Zimmerman, who is the German ambassador to Mexico. And he says, because all those other policies are World War II, Zimmerman says, you know what, Mexico, we know you ticked off at the United States because they took the northern half of your country. Plus, Mexican War, 1848. Plus, they're trying to chase down Pancho Villa and they're taking over the port of Veracruz and they're doing all kinds of stuff they shouldn't do. They've invaded your country 3 or 4 times in the last couple of years. We know you're ticked off at them. So what you should do is declare war on them. And we will send some troops over to help you. So you keep them tied up over here. Make sure they don't get involved in Europe. When we're done in Europe, we'll send the bulk of the German military over to help you defeat the United States of America and take back the land you lost in 1848. And Mexico said, intriguing. But when the telegram was sent to them, it was also interpreted by British spies, who then said, hey, United States, guess what we found? And we said, that looks interesting. And they said, hey, we're going to publish this in every major market newspaper in England and the United States. And we said, you could hold off on that. And they went, nope. So they published it. And the reason they published it was to make sure that there was some public reaction to this telegram, like, how dare you? Because England had wanted us to join this war for quite a while, and our president was really resistant to it, even though he was getting ready for the eventuality. But the president was resistant because he knew the American people were not behind him, and he was correct about that. But the newspaper coverage of the Zimmerman telegram really changed that. So people in the United States were like, oh, they can't do that to us. We're the United States. And so we were pretty excited about the war effort. So when the United States does join the war effort, after the 14-point speech, then the United States is fairly well behind the war effort, and lots of volunteers show up. So, all right. So Mexican War, Reconquista. The Reconquista is the idea that Mexico will get back the land that was lost in the Mexican War. And some people would argue that the modern Reconquista is immigration. A really interesting discussion if you ever get to have a Mexican history class or modern US history class. I think it's a fascinating discussion. You're going like, yeah, we don't care. You do care. I know you do. Okay. So our entry into the war is pretty well timed because the side that we join is losing a member. The Russians have decided that they're done because they're about to not be the Russians anymore. They're about to be the Soviet Union. So they're having an internal revolution. You know who else is still going through their internal revolution during this time period? Do you know? I know you do. It's Mexico. So there's the Mexican Revolution. Lenin's doing his thing there in Russia. And then Stalin's going to make Lenin look like he was just joking around. So yeah, there's some stuff going on. So Russia drops out, the United States drops in, and it's probably a good swap for this group of allies because we haven't been fighting for a few years and our resources are bigger and we aren't having an internal revolution. So we're probably a better ally in a variety of ways. All right, stuff that's going on in the United States during World War I. I'm sorry, scrolling down to see what else we've got going here. All right. Before we officially join, or right after we officially join the war effort, and most of our troops, it does take a little while. We joined the war effort in 1917. It's either end of March or early April. And then the bulk of the troops that we send arrive in 1918. The war ends in 1918 and the treaty in 1919. So this probably ushered in the end. However, I would always caution you, like if you go to visit Europe and you've got one of those shirts that says USA 2-0 in World Wars, don't take that one on your European vacation. Leave that one at home. The way our European allies would see it as we waited until they were almost dead to try to help instead of intervening early and preventing a lot of death. The way the US perspective is we had to go in and save the day. So you can see how those perspectives might offend each other. So after we joined the war, Wilson says, here are the 14 reasons, because he's a college professor, he can't just have 3, 14 reasons that we joined the war. So it's a 14-point speech. And the primary things we tend to remember are freedom of the seas, self-determination, free trade, open diplomacy, treaties with no secrets, and creation of a peacekeeping organization to prevent future world wars, the League of Nations. Also a statement against colonialism, but not preventing it. And the reason that Wilson thought this speech would be important is progressives probably were generally not in favor of joining a world war because it would slow down the progress that we were making here in the United States. However, if you could say you're going to do all these things within the world, then they would go like, oh, this is global progressivism. This is even better. The one thing in there that probably isn't exactly what it sounds like is self-determination. Like if you think of self-determination, do you have a thought in your head what self-determination would be? Any thoughts? What is self-determination to you? Can't even be wrong. What does it mean to you? I'm smiling at you, so that's kind of a scary smile. Yes, I think yes, belief in oneself. I think that's what most people think of when they hear self-determination. And I don't know if you remember from your ancient, several years ago, world history class, what it actually means. They may not even talk about it because they have to talk about everything, but self-determination meant that people within the country's borders could determine who got to live there. So one of the big problems with World War I is that the different ethnic groups were fighting. So self-determination meant that each ethnic group would get to have its own small nation. So the Serbs could live here, the Croats could live here, the Bosnians could live here, and they wouldn't have to live together and fight with each other. So the US version of that would be, I don't know, people of Mexican descent, we get Texas, people of Cuban descent, we get Florida, people who are Vietnamese would get Minnesota, people who are Chinese would get California, people with those descent, and people who are Japanese would get Oregon, and people who were Swedish would get Michigan. It'd have to be someplace cold, right? But the idea, I mean, it's a really kind of odd and foreign idea in the United States, but that's what they wanted to do. And the thought was, if the different ethnic groups had their own country, they wouldn't fight with each other. Yeah, it's probably not going to work. All right, so, and that part, it kind of does happen, and it's going to probably create more problems. All right, at home, what's going on in the United States during World War I? Stuff. Committee of Public Information is controlling pro-war and anti-German propaganda and controlling the media. So you've got censorship within magazines and newspapers, radio, and movies a little bit, although most of them are silent movies that, they have captions. Everybody stops drinking. Probably not. The 18th Amendment passes right at the end of this, and women gain the right to vote. The book makes a point, a case for women gaining the right to vote, maybe being tied to their efforts in World War I, might also be tied to the fact that it's, been a while since they passed the 15th Amendment, and women have been working on this for some time, and they do capitalize on the event of the war, and I think women's participation in that war. And maybe Woodrow Wilson's second marriage as well. That's kind of a story into itself. So we passed some amendments, 16, 17, 18, 19 during this era, 18 and 19 or the same year the war ends. The Espionage and Sedition Acts limited anti-war and anti-government speech, so you have more censorship, but not of media, but of individuals. So if you publicly denounce the war effort, if you say something bad about the president, you could be arrested and potentially deported. So there you go. Espionage and Sedition Act. It might remind you a little of the Alien and Sedition Acts from the Adams administration, and that's a fair comparison. Issues of race and ethnicity are compounded potentially by World War I related biases. So lynchings are going to continue. You'll notice there'll be certain cities where there's going to be people moving from the south to the north a little bit, not the same way as World War II. This is not going to relocate, 4 or 5 million people, but it is going to be a large number of people. It's not that big. And it's not for as long a period of time, because notice, the war is 1914 to 1918 with the treaty in 1919. We joined in 1917, and the fighting ends, within the next year and a half. So this is not a long-term effort, and we've mentioned it takes a good part, of 4 or 5 months to get troops actually involved. We don't even get troops in combat until 1918. So our involvement in this war is brief. So, don't go overboard if you talk about women in the workforce. They did not take over the workforce. We didn't draft every available man. It's not a long-term conflict the way World War II was for the United States, but you do see some women gaining entry into the workforce, serving in certain ways in the military. So, and it's public. So that part of it does encourage change. All right. But issues of race and ethnicity, let's go back to that, compounded by World War I related biases. So when the people relocated for jobs, sorry, that's where I was headed. Sometimes there were African Americans who came from the South to the North, and it caused people in the North to now suddenly appear to be racist, just like people in the South. And, you've probably read about communities in certain cities. I think the one that people talk about the most during this time of year is, well, because of Black History Month and for other reasons as well, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, near where I'm from, where a very prominent neighborhood of African American homes and businesses rose in Tulsa, and then people got frustrated because there are African Americans who are having economic success. So you start to see lynchings and terrorism, literal bombings with the Tulsa riots. And if you don't know much about that, that might be interesting for you to read about, because there's definitely stuff written about that. But there's lots of violence against African Americans, including lynchings, and lynchings will increase. And you'll also start to see a bit of a rise of the KKK again, because that relocation of African Americans is from south to north. So the more prominent locations for the KKK in the 20s are going to be in the Midwest. It's more of a Midwestern or Northern thing. So lynchings continue. Wilson screens Birth of a Nation at the White House, which is that really racist movie that says the KKK saved civilization in the South. So it paints the KKK in a heroic light, which is a pretty astonishing way to paint them. The NAACP, National Association for Advancement of Colored People, becomes more active. And I know, because some of you have noticed in your weekly question, like if you say colored or if you say Negro in your writing and there aren't quotation marks, I'm going to mention it to you. It's like, yeah, don't do that. But I always would have a high school student when I taught just high school, at the high school. I would always have a high school student that would say, well, like, if we're not supposed to say that, how come we still have the NAACP? Because nobody ever says what it means. It's just an acronym also at this point. And also it's really old. Yeah, it's been around since, over 100 years. So they're probably not going to rename it because it has name recognition. But yeah, people don't usually say what each letter means. Anyway, NAACP becomes more active, and they're also starting to gain some traction. They're starting to become more effective, more organized, much more of a corporate entity, hiring a legal arm and an educational arm, that sort of stuff. Immigration restrictions by race and ethnicity will continue. So, of course, during the war, nobody's coming in because it's a war. But after the war, we are going to really restrict immigration and say, okay, Europeans, we've noticed that you start world wars. We'd like for you to stay home. Racial violence comes north with the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North for defense industry jobs. And you'll also see the rise and fall of a fellow named Marcus Garvey, who would be an interesting fellow for you to read about for book review potentially as well. And again, back to the thing I just said about terms being a little archaic. His organization was called the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. He's really prominent in the New York area. and leads lots of marches and parades and protests. And he's kind of the early Black is beautiful kind of guy. And he will be convicted and imprisoned, and then he's eventually deported. He's from Jamaica for, um, goodness, why can't I think of, I can think of what it is, but I just can't think of what it's called. When you steal embezzlement, there we go, embezzlement. He started something called the Black Star Cruise Line, which took cruises from the United States to Africa, and he was convicted of stealing money from that. And lots of people think that it was a conspiracy because he was unpopular with the government. And if you're one of those folks like, nah, the government would never do stuff like that, okay, we'll talk about more things the government does in the 20s that definitely set people up, and you'll go like, maybe. We seem to have these time periods in our history where we're pretty sketchy as a government, and the government will intentionally do something they know is not honest to either save their reputation or harm someone else's. In this instance, probably to harm someone else's. Now, I am not an expert on if Marcus, whether I'm not an expert on Marcus Garvey either, but I'm not an expert on whether Marcus Garvey was innocent or guilty. But most historians agree that the government prosecution of Sacco and Vanzetti was at best staged, and at worst, yeah, no, it's pretty bad. And there's some other things that happen in the 20s. There'll be a guy who's the head of the KKK that runs for president, the party nomination, and nearly gets the party nomination. So the 20s is a fairly corrupt decade. And some of you are going like, which one isn't? There are times, I mean, in some ways the progressive era is good. They're trying to fix some stuff. I know it's not good for race. I mean, I keep pointing that out to you, so clearly I know that. You'll notice that we try to make some pretty important changes in the 50s and 60s. Certainly the Reconstruction era, which you already discussed, was it a failure or a success? In some ways, we make some changes that, to this day still impact us. But yeah, I know certain decades we're just a mess, aren't we? I think the 20s will be one of those. All right, but Marcus Garvey, kind of an interesting fellow. Yeah, the 20s right now they're a little messy as well, and it's complicated by pandemic, and then here's snowpocalypse, which may have revealed some other problems we have with the utility structure in Texas. So, and this could lead to, this is why I don't get as worried about stuff as, some of my other friends. It's like, oh, it'll never get better. Like, we tend to go in cycles in the United States. So you noticed we had the Gilded Age, which was incredibly corrupt and, just that kind of predatory capitalism. And then the next era is, man, we can't do stuff like that anymore. And usually we follow a, oh my gosh, everything's terrible era with a, we've got to make sure that never happens again era. And I really kind of think that's where we're headed, but I know the process feels slow when you're in it. Excuse me, it's much better to study it than be in it. Much better. It's my impression. I say this as somebody from, going from the 70s to the 80s and 90s was a little painful too. We kind of had a little Vietnam hangover, and we just thought all government was terrible. Well, because they lied to us all the time. So, and I think it's why people of my age, I'm old, I'm in my 50s, and a little bit older than me. So the 50s, like mid 50s to mid 60s people, we just think if the government's talking, they're lying, because that's the way it was when we were kids. I don't know what you guys think. I don't know. It's hard to say, isn't it? Nobody even knows what they think right now. So, but I mean politically. All right, as the war ends, we should probably get back to this because I know I'm about to get the 3-minute warning. I got to keep going. And I appreciate the 3-minute warning. As the war ends, Wilson creates the League of Nations, or Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, which were incredibly popular in not the United States, in Europe. And they're very excited. They hail him as a hero. He has a little stroke. He comes home, has a big stroke, can't talk, can't walk, can't write. And we don't sign the Treaty of Versailles, and we don't join the League of Nations. And then our next president, Harding, he ushers in that decade of what the heck, no more sacrifice, kind of a party decade. And he wants, as he calls it, a return to normalcy. And the 20s begin with harassing people we think might be communists and seeing a rise of the KKK and underground bars and speakeasies and stuff like that. So we're going from this progressive era to a World War to let's have a party. So, and the let's have a party in the 20s has a giant hangover in the 1930s. It's an enormous mess. All right. So we'll talk really, really specifically about the weekly question next time. Am I sharing? Share the weekly question. But weekly question being, explain the reasons for and describe the U.S. participation in World War I. You can always do the main thing, because we're certainly involved in some of the main things. But I think you really have to mention the Zimmerman note, or the Zimmerman telegram. If you don't, I'm going to think you weren't paying attention during class, you didn't read the book, and you're answering with a world history answer, okay? Because remember, it's U.S. history, so we really want to know what bugged the United States. So you've got to have a description of the Zimmerman note. And don't just say, we joined because of the Zimmerman telegram. You better tell me what was in it. See how I'm threatening you there? Describe how World War I transformed the roles of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And we'll talk more specifically about that part next time as well. We'll start class with that. But women, you see them briefly in the workforce. And when you talk about that, don't overplay it. You know, don't say like, they ran the country for years while the men were gone. The men were gone for a year. Okay. And I know that the transition back was kind of tough, but this is not the thing that happened in World War II, where women really are, you know, primary actors in the workforce. And then when the men come back, they've got the GI Bill, so they might go to college, or they don't all come back, plus they're gone for 4 or 5 years. So the women are really used to this, you know, we're working and raising the kids, and we have, you know, decent jobs. In World War I, as soon as the war was over and the dudes came back, the employer said, okay, women, go home and be with the kids again. So this is kind of a temporary influx of women into the workforce because of the war effort. Certainly there were women already in the workforce, in especially clerical jobs in cities, and the Charlotte Perkins Gilman idea that women can gain some autonomy if they have jobs. Most women didn't do that. But World War I gave a brief foray into the workforce, which really was brief. As a rule, women just went back home. African Americans, we definitely draft. Oh, and women did serve in the military a little bit. Typically not in non-combat roles, sometimes in nursing organization, that sort of thing. But anybody who's been in the military can tell you that if you're serving in a war effort, you may be in a combat role or in a combat situation, whether that was the intention or not. Because, you know, people don't say like, well, we're not going to attack this base, because they're technically a support base, not a combat activity base. You know, it's war. So African Americans, we drafted African Americans, typically had them serve in either more dangerous places. We'll typically have them serve in more dangerous places. And maybe doing more of the like cleanup kind of work, or building infrastructure, destroying infrastructure, manual labor sort of stuff, and probably not paying African Americans well, not giving them too many opportunities to get promoted. And certainly the military still segregated during this era. And Hispanic Americans, you see some drafting as well, but you can also talk about how African Americans, Hispanic Americans are treated in the United States during the war effort. And you see really more discrimination against African Americans as they relocate for war industry jobs, probably Detroit area, Chicago area, but you'll see a small diaspora or migration during that time period. Hispanic Americans, The book will talk about how we're pretty keen on Mexican immigration during this time period because, open border sort of thing. And we're excited about Mexican immigrants who work in the agriculture sector because we need more food, because we're supplying food to everybody who's bombing each other. However, the relationship between the United States and Mexico is strained at best. So there might be more appreciation and opportunity for Mexicans in limited agricultural sectors, as far as international appreciation for each other's governments, not so much during this time period, not so much. Okay, I'm probably about to stop. I don't know if I got ahead of yep, there we go. I knew it was almost time, so. All right, so before we go, you guys have any questions? And I want to double check the roll just to make sure I got everybody who came. You guys should all appreciate the 3-minute warning. I suspect you do. So thank you for that. All right, and let me go ahead and stop the recording.